Hello, ladies and gents. I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company. And today we're going to talk about strip piecing and making 4 patches. We have this pattern available for you all. And I made this quilt completely out of scrap leftover fabric. The ends of binding strips and just fabric that was left over when I made a quilt. So that's a lot of fun. So we're going to talk about the first segment of this quilt today, and that's making a 4 patch. So you can see where it goes in the quilt. And you can notice I'm not completely scrappy. I refer to myself as organized scrappy. But first we're going to talk about the advantages of strip piecing. So we're going to sew these together on the long end, and then we'll be able to cut them apart. Now, if we didn't sew these together first, then we'd have to cut our 2.5-inch squares off of here and then our 2.5-inch squares off of here. But this way, we can do that once. And I'm going to show you a little trick that makes this even faster. So the first thing we're going to do is sew these strips together on the long side. And I take where the selvages are and kind of match that up because we're going to trim those off. You want to sew these together with your scant 1/4-inch seam allowance that you use for quilting. And I explain a lot more of this in my Quilting 101 class, which will be available online soon. So as you sew it, make sure that you get the edges together. So you notice I stop periodically and line up the next part that I'm going to sew. Okay, let's just get rid of these tails. And then we're going to head over to the ironing board. Okay, so what you don't want to do is iron from the back. If you iron from the back, you can't see your seam, and you'll get these little things where I call tuckies, and that messes up your seam allowance, plus it makes your blocks not fit together. So you want to iron from the front. So people say to me, but then I can't see the seam allowance. I don't know where it is. So if you follow these instructions, you'll know exactly where your seam allowance is. You want to lay it down with the seam away from you and with the piece you're going to press toward on top. So in this case, we're pressing toward the dark piece. And then the first thing you want to do is set your seam. And what that does is it just kind of warms up the threads, and makes them easier to move. So then we're going to take this and lay it back, and I'm just going to kind of nudge it softly with my iron. Sometimes you can use the point, sometimes you can use the side, but you notice I'm pushing it back with my fingers but staying out of the steam range so I don't get burned. And I'm just nudging that back. But this way, when I'm pressing from the top, I know exactly where my seam allowance is. You don't want to flip this back and pull on it because you'll flip your seam allowance. But I know where my seam allowance is, and I can see my seam, so I know I'm pressing it flat. Now, inevitably, pressing something this long, it's not perfectly straight. So what you want to do is put the iron on one end and just give it a gentle tug, which will straighten it out, and then repress it. Now, I told you that I made this quilt completely from scraps, and I've been working with whole strips here just to demonstrate. But what you can do, and your background strips might be scrap too, but these are pieces that were left over. And so I kind of measured them because we're going to cut 2.5-inch strips. So this one measures 6.5. So 2.5 times 2 is 5. So I'll just trim it around 5.5 before I lay it on here, so I'm not wasting lots of my background fabric. And so then you can just lay these on. This one I measured earlier, and it's around 15 inches, so that works out nicely. And then you'll just go ahead and sew those on just like we did this, and then press them back, and then cut them into your 2.5-inch segments. Now, this is that little trick I was going to tell you about. So we could just cut our 2.5-inch wedges, or we can take this and stack them. So I'm going to line up my selvages, and then I'm going to make sure, and teach yourself how to do this, how to feel that the seams are together. If they're not together, you'll feel a hole in there, or if they're overlapping, it'll be a big bump. And so you want to make sure that those are together. And we'll keep checking that as we're cutting. Then I'm going to take, I like to use a smaller ruler when I'm doing something like this. This is a 6.5 by 12.5 creative grid ruler. The big ruler is a lot to move around. So the first thing we're going to do is trim off this end. And you can do it from the other side of the table, or spin the mat around. I'm going to do what my students all call my crazy backwards cleanup cut. You have to be really careful with it and get your body out of the way. But you want to line up this seam line here with a line on the ruler. If you try and line up with the edges, somehow it just doesn't work. So I'm going to do my cleanup cut real quickly, and then we're going to start cutting 2.5-inch sections. Now, every time you cut one, make sure you're lined up on the seam and you're lined up on the edge of the 2.5-inch line. So I'm going to cut this, move it out of the way. I'm going to check again. Now, inevitably, at some point in time, as you're cutting this strip, it's not going to line up. And it's just, there's little minute bends that our eyes don't really pick up, but the ruler does. So if you get to a spot like that, you just need to do another cleanup cut real quickly and straighten it out. So let's see. Well, we'll just say this wasn't straight. So I'm just going to line up on the ruler, and just a little sliver is all you need to cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that and get that fabric out of the way. And then I'm going to go on my merry way cutting. Every time checking to make sure it's straight. Okay? Now, what you'll notice here is by stacking these are all ready to sew. So you don't have to go back and match them. You can just pick them up and start sewing. And you can chain piece these together. It saves thread and movement. Okay, so there we've got a couple. I can cut these apart. Now, when you trim something like this, don't trim your threads right at the edge of the fabric, because if you do, your seam will start coming open. You want to leave about 1/4 inch of that twisted thread out there because that keeps your seam together. Now we're going to head back over to the iron, and once again put the seam away from you. On these, it doesn't matter which way we press. So we're just going to press these open, set the seam, lift it up, press it back, and voila, we have our cute little 4 patches. So thank you very much for watching. Be sure and press the like button and the subscribe button, and we'll talk to you again soon.